There are moments inside that family, and if you've followed the House of Windsor for any length of time, you will know exactly which family I mean, when the silence says everything the words refuse to. Not the gilded, rehearsed silence of a state occasion. Not the dignified pause before a wreath is laid or a bell is tolled. Something older, something heavier. The kind of silence that settles into a room like weather, that makes the air change temperature, that causes even the most composed people in Britain to go very, very still. This is a story about one of those moments. And before we go any further, I want to be clear about something important. What you are about to hear is commentary and analysis built around verified public information, documented royal history, and the kind of informed speculation that any serious observer of this family engages in when the official record goes quiet. This is not a claim of insider access. This is not presented as confirmed fact. It is, as with so much that concerns the private life of the British royal family, a piecing together of fragments, a reading of the silences, a following of threads that the palace itself has chosen never to fully explain. With that understood, let's begin. Because some threads, once you pick them up, don't let you go. The ring in question, and there is a ring at the center of all of this, is not famous in the way that the sapphire engagement ring is famous. It doesn't have a Wikipedia entry, it was never photographed on a red carpet or catalogued in an official inventory of royal jewels. It was, by most accounts, deeply personal, a private piece, the kind of thing a woman keeps not because of what it's worth in any monetary sense, but because of what it means. Because of who gave it, or where it came from, or what she was feeling the day it first sat on her finger. And that is precisely why, when Princess Anne saw it sitting in Camilla's private quarters at Windsor, something inside her went completely cold. We'll come back to the ring. We'll come back to Anne's face in that moment, and what she did next, and what it set into motion. But to understand why any of this matters, why it matters so deeply, so viscerally, to everyone in that family who was old enough to remember, you have to go back. You have to go back to Diana. You always have to go back to Diana. There is a generation of people who learned about the British royal family through her, not through textbooks or ceremonial broadcasts, not through the dry mechanics of constitutional monarchy, but through her, through the photographs of her holding children in hospitals, kneeling on the floor to be at their eye level, through the extraordinary, almost unbearable candor of that panorama interview, through the way she carried herself in public, that particular combination of vulnerability and grace that made millions of people feel, irrationally but genuinely, that they knew her, that she was theirs in some way. And then she was gone. August 1997. Paris. A tunnel. And the world, or at least a significant portion of it, broke open. What remained, beyond the grief, beyond the flowers at Kensington Palace that stretched further than anyone could quite believe, were objects, heirlooms, keepsakes. The material residue of a life lived largely in public, but felt, by those closest to her, in private. Her sons have spoken, carefully, about what it means to have those things. William once described keeping a photograph of her in a locket that Catherine gave him. Harry has spoken about her jewelry, pieces that went to him in trust, intended for the woman he would one day marry. The allocation of Diana's personal effects was, by all accounts that have made their way into the public domain, deeply considered. Nothing was accidental. Nothing was scattered carelessly. Which is what made it so extraordinary, so quietly devastating, when Anne walked into that room and saw what she saw. Now, Windsor Castle in the winter carries a particular quality that anyone who has spent time in the English countryside will recognize. The light comes in low and slightly gold even in the middle of the afternoon, and the rooms that don't face south feel dim by 3 o'clock. It is a place that has absorbed centuries of family life, arguments and reconciliations, births and deaths, the long, grinding administration of dynasty. The walls have heard things. The carpets have been walked by people carrying burdens that history recorded, and burdens that history never will. It was in this setting, during one of those routine family gatherings that pepper the royal calendar without ever being announced, the kind of quiet weekend visit that serves as domestic maintenance rather than occasion, that Anne found herself in a corridor she didn't usually frequent. The details of exactly how she came to be there, and exactly what she was looking for, belong to the category of things that are known only to those present. What is not disputed, among those who have followed this story as it has moved through the networks of people who observe this family closely is that she went in, and that she came out changed. The item was not hidden. That's the first thing that strikes you when you think about it carefully. It was simply there, sitting on a surface, a dressing table, according to some accounts, or perhaps a small chest of drawers, in the way that personal jewelry simply sits when someone has taken it off and set it down without thinking or without caring about who might see it. And Anne saw it. She picked it up, she turned it over, and she knew. This is the part that requires you to understand something about Princess Anne that the public image doesn't always convey. The horsewoman, the no-nonsense one. The royal who, in countless profiles and interviews over the decades, has been described as the most practically minded, the least sentimental, the one least likely to be undone by symbolism or ceremony. All of that is true, and none of it means she was immune to this. Because what Anne had that perhaps others in that family lacked was a specific, granular, embodied memory of Diana, not as a phenomenon, not as an icon, as a woman she knew. A sister-in-law she watched arrive into this family, young and bewildered, watched struggle and shine and fracture and fight. And in that memory were details, specific, particular details, including details about jewelry. There was something about this ring, a mark or an inscription or some quality of the setting that Anne could place with absolute precision inside a specific memory. A specific afternoon, a specific context in which she had seen Diana wearing it, or holding it, or talking about it. The mind, under the impact of genuine shock, sometimes does something useful. It becomes very, very sharp. It cuts through the noise and goes straight to the evidence. And Anne's mind, in that moment, was doing exactly that. She set the ring back down, exactly as she had found it, and she left the room. What she did not do in the hours that followed was say anything. Not immediately. This is important. This is, in fact, very revealing about the kind of person she is, and the kind of family this is. There was no immediate confrontation, no sharp intake of breath followed by a corridor scene. Anne is not impulsive. She is, in the language of her generation and her upbringing, a woman who thinks before she speaks. And what she was thinking, in those hours, was something like, "Am I certain?" And then, once she had turned that question over enough times to satisfy herself, "What does this mean?" And then, finally, the question that was perhaps the hardest of all, "What do I do with this?" She is not, after all, Diana's family. She is Charles's sister. She is part of the institution that, in Diana's own telling, failed her. She has spent decades navigating the internal politics of a family that does not, as a rule, air its tensions openly. She knows what it costs to bring something like this into the light. She knows what walls go up, what silence descends, what mechanisms of deflection and denial come into play when someone inside this family challenges the settled version of events. But she also knew what she had seen. And here is where the story of the ring intersects with something else. Something that had been building in that family, particularly for William, for years. The question of what Diana's memory meant to the next generation. Not just to her sons, who carry it with the particular weight of the bereaved, but to her grandchildren, the children who never knew her, who know her only through photographs and stories, and the deliberate, careful way that William and Catherine have tried to keep her present in their home. George, Charlotte, Louis. Children who grew up hearing her name spoken with a love that also contained grief, who learned early that their grandmother was someone the whole world mourned. George, the eldest, the one who will one day be king, who has grown up knowing this in a way that must be both ordinary, because it has always been true, and staggering, because at some point the abstraction of it becomes real. He is said to be a thoughtful child, quiet in the way that some children are quiet when they are taking everything in. William has spoken, in careful terms, about making sure his children know who Diana was. Not the icon, the woman, the mother he lost. And at Kensington Palace, on a morning that had been marked in the family's private calendar for some time, one of those quiet, personal pilgrimages that never make the official schedule, George had written a note. Not typed, not dictated, not composed with any adult's assistance, by all the accounts that have circulated among those who were present that day. Written by hand, in a child's handwriting, in the particular grammar of a child who is trying very hard to say something true. He left it at the memorial, folded, private. Not for anyone else to read. But these things, in families as observed as this one, have a way of becoming known. Not publicly, not in any newspaper, but known, passed from person to person in the way that significant private moments always travel in closed circles, carried not with malice, but with the weight of shared feeling. And what that note said, the gist of it, the emotional core of it, the thing that made those who heard about it go very quiet, was something about wanting her to know that she was still there, still with them, that he thought about her, that he understood, in whatever way a child can understand, that she had mattered, and that she still did. Princess Anne heard about the note before she found the ring. Let that settle for a moment. She heard about it the way things are heard about in that family, indirectly, through the particular channels of proximity and trust that exist within any extended family, but are especially pronounced in one where proximity is managed so carefully. She heard what the note had said, and it moved her in the way that only a person who knew Diana, who knew the real person, with all her fears and hopes, and the particular way she laughed, could be moved. Not sentiment, something more specific than that, recognition. And then, days later, she found the ring. It is almost impossible, once you know the sequence, not to feel the weight of the juxtaposition. A child's private note to a grandmother he never knew. And then, in a room that child will never visit, on a surface belonging to the woman who replaced that grandmother in the family's formal structure, the ring. Anne did not collapse in the way that word is sometimes used to describe dramatic physical events. She is not that kind of woman, and this is not that kind of story. What happened was quieter than that, and in some ways more devastating for its quietness. She went still. Those who know her describe a quality she has when something genuinely shocks her, not a physical flinching, but a kind of drawing inward, a gathering of herself, a face that becomes very composed precisely because composure is what's required. And it is in that composure, in those moments, that the emotion is most visible to anyone who knows what they're looking at. She left the room. She spent some time, hours by some accounts, doing what she always does when processing something difficult, occupying herself physically, moving through the routines of the day with the controlled practicality that has always been her armor. And then she went to Charles. This is the moment I want you to sit with, because it is the emotional centerpiece of everything that followed. Not the discovery, not even the confrontation, in whatever form it took, but the walk to her brother, the decision to tell him. Because here is a woman who has spent her entire life navigating the internal politics of a family that does not welcome disruption, going to her brother, who is now the king, who is now in the most public and scrutinized chapter of his reign, to say, I need to talk to you about something. The conversation, as it has been described by those with knowledge of it, was not loud. Of course it wasn't. These are people who were raised to believe that visible emotional display is a form of failure, that the management of feeling is as important as the feeling itself, that the appropriate response to almost anything is to lower your voice rather than raise it. They are, in this sense, the products of a very particular English aristocratic tradition that equates restraint with strength and expressiveness with weakness. What this tradition produces, under pressure, is not absence of feeling. It is feeling that has nowhere to go, that presses against all the available surfaces from the inside, that manifests in the way a voice becomes very measured, in the way the eyes become very still, in the set of a jaw that is working very hard to keep everything contained. Anne told him what she had found. Precisely, calmly, in the way a person delivers information when they have already decided that the information, by itself, is enough, that they do not need to embellish, or dramatize, or even entirely explain, because the other person will understand immediately and completely. Charles went very quiet. This is the thing about Charles that is easy to overlook if you've spent years watching him in public mode. The ceremonial version, the speeches and the walkabouts and the meetings with dignitaries, and the careful, considered public persona he has assembled over decades of intense scrutiny. In private, particularly in matters connected to Diana, he has never been as composed as he appears. Those who have been close to him describe a man who carries that chapter of his life, the marriage, the failure of it, and what followed, with a heaviness that has never fully lifted. It would be strange if it hadn't. He is, whatever else he is, a man who lost the mother of his children in circumstances that the world never stopped arguing about. And now his sister was standing in front of him, telling him that his wife had something in her possession that had no business being there. He did not, from what can be gathered, immediately explain. He did not produce a ready account. He did not say, "Ah, yes, that. I know exactly how that came to be there. Let me tell you." The silence that followed Anne's disclosure was not the silence of a man gathering his thoughts before speaking. It was the silence of a man for whom the ground had just shifted under his feet, and who was not yet sure, or not yet willing to reveal, how far it had shifted. That silence, for Anne, was itself a kind of answer. Now we need to think about the question that silence poses. Because if Charles's response had been immediate and clear, if he had said, "Yes, I gave it to her, here is why, here is the context, here is the entirely innocent explanation," then there would be no story. The ring would have a provenance. The provenance would be painful, perhaps, given how charged any transfer of Diana's things to Camilla would inevitably be, but it would be explicable. It would be within the range of things that can be processed, however reluctantly, by a family that has already processed so much. His silence suggested something different. It suggested, and this is speculation, this is the informed interpretation of a watcher rather than a witness, that either he genuinely did not know how the ring had come to be there, or that he knew and could not find the words, or that he knew and the knowing was itself a problem. Any of those three possibilities is troubling in its own way. The question of how Camilla came to possess something that belonged to Diana is one that spirals outward in several directions, none of them comfortable. There are those who suggest, and this has been part of the quiet, sustained commentary around the Wales marriage and its aftermath for decades, that certain items moved through channels that were never formally documented. That the chaos of the immediate aftermath of Diana's death, and the decades of legal and personal sorting that followed, created opportunities for things to be acquired, or kept, that might not have survived closer scrutiny. This is not an accusation. It is a documented feature of the aftermath of any significant estate that things go missing, or change hands in ways that later seem difficult to account for. But Diana was not just any estate, and this was not just any ring. What makes it specifically significant, beyond the raw fact of its provenance, is what it represents. Diana's belongings are not neutral objects. They are freighted with meaning in a way that almost nothing else connected to this family is. For William and Harry, her sons, they are physical connections to a mother taken early and violently and publicly. For George and Charlotte and Louis, they are what heritage looks like when it becomes personal rather than institutional. The crown jewels are abstract. Your grandmother's ring is not. And Camilla having it. Camilla, whose relationship with Diana was as complicated and painful as any relationship can be. Camilla, whose presence in the marriage was, in Diana's own words, and by most historical accounts, one of the defining wounds of that marriage. Camilla having it changes something. Not just in terms of ownership, but in terms of what it means about the story that was told and the story that was actually true. William and Catherine had not been present when Anne discovered the ring. But in the way of things in that family, the news moved. It moved carefully and quietly, and with the particular tension that comes when information is significant enough that people handle it gently for fear of what it might do. Catherine, it has been said, received the news with the stillness that is her hallmark, a containment that those close to her describe as something she has cultivated with great deliberateness. The armor of a woman who came from outside this institution and learned its mechanisms the hard way. The stillness, in her case, is never quite the same as calm. William's reaction was something different, more interior, more compressed. Those who know him describe a man who, when anything connected to his mother surfaces, does not erupt but rather turns in on himself in a way that those close to him find more concerning than any outburst would be. He carries Diana's memory with a protectiveness that is partly grief and partly something older and more complicated. The protectiveness of a child who watched his mother be hurt and could not stop it, and has spent the decades since ensuring, wherever he can, that she is not hurt further. Even now, even in death, perhaps especially then. The idea that something of hers had been sitting in Camilla's room, not in a vault, not in an officially logged collection, but simply there, casually, as though it belonged, would have landed on William with the full force of everything he has spent years trying to keep contained. It reopens questions. That is the thing about this kind of discovery. It doesn't just raise a question about this specific object, it reopens all the prior questions that were never quite fully answered, about what was known and when, about what was agreed to privately and what was kept from those who had a right to know, about the unofficial history of a family that has always maintained a very careful distance between the version it presents and the one it actually lives. The memorial, George's note, Anne's discovery. These three things, arriving in proximity to each other, created a kind of triangulation, a moment where the distance between the official story and the private one suddenly felt very small. And it is in that small space, that narrow gap, where the real drama of this family always lives. It has been said, by people who know both siblings, who have watched them operate inside and outside the royal context for years, that the relationship between William and Charles has never fully recovered from everything that surrounded Diana's death and what came after. Not broken, not severed, but altered in ways that are subtle and stubborn, and that surface, reliably, whenever anything happens to remind William of what that period cost him. He is publicly loyal, he is institutionally committed. He is, to the outside eye, a dutiful and serious heir, doing the work of preparation for a role he has always known was coming. But there are rooms inside William, interior rooms that anyone who has read his occasional unguarded interviews or watched him in moments when the professional mask slips will recognize that Charles has never had access to. Not since 1997. Not since the boys were walked behind that coffin in a display of royal stoicism that even at the time struck many observers as asking an extraordinary thing of two grieving children. Those rooms stayed locked. And the thing about locked rooms, in families as observed as this one, is that their contents don't dissipate. They accumulate. What George's note did, and this is, perhaps, the most quietly remarkable thing about this whole sequence of events, was to open one of those rooms, briefly, in public, or at least in the semi-public of family. Here was the third generation. Here was the child who will one day be king of a country that will still, in all probability, regard Diana as one of the most significant figures to have passed through its national life. And he had gone to her memorial and written her a letter, a private letter, in a child's hand. There is something about that, about the sheer uncalculated sincerity of it, that bypasses all the armor. Anne is not a woman who cries easily, not at public occasions, not at private ones. She is too controlled, too conditioned, too thoroughly trained in the arts of emotional management. But the combination of what she heard about that note and what she then saw in that room, the ring, sitting there, belonging to the woman that child had just privately written to, was too much. It was simply too much. The tears, when they came, were not performative. They were the tears of a woman who had been holding something for a very long time, and who, in that particular concatenation of circumstances, could no longer hold it. They were tears for Diana, yes, but also, perhaps, tears for the family Diana had tried to become part of and never quite could. Tears for the boys she watched grow up without her. Tears for the little boy who sat down and wrote a letter to a grandmother he will never meet. Tears for all the things that this family has been unable to say to each other across the decades. For all the silences that have compounded on top of each other. For the particular tragedy of a family so public and so powerful that it has never quite developed the tools to tend to its own interior life. And then she dried her eyes and she went back to being Princess Anne, because that is what you do. The conversation between Anne and Charles did not end with a resolution. These conversations, in this family, rarely do. There are no dramatic revelations, no sudden confessions, no scenes of tearful reconciliation followed by clarity. What there tends to be is the cessation of pressure, a moment when something has been said that cannot be unsaid, and both parties understand this, and the conversation moves into a kind of holding pattern while the individuals involved decide, privately, what comes next. Charles did not explain, not in any way that Anne found satisfying, and his inability, or unwillingness, to explain is the thing that has continued to reverberate, because in the absence of explanation, the imagination fills the space. And in a family that is already deeply familiar with the experience of being told incomplete truths about things that mattered enormously, the failure to explain is never just a failure to explain. It is evidence. Not of any specific wrongdoing, necessarily, but of something that was managed rather than resolved, something that was absorbed into the ongoing administration of this family's private life without being properly dealt with. The ring is still, as far as anyone outside that immediate circle knows, where it was. Nothing has been formally said about it. Nothing has been publicly acknowledged. The palace, in this as in all things that touch on the internal life of the family, has said nothing. Because the palace never speaks about these things. It waits, it manages, it redirects. But something has shifted. These things always shift something, even when they shift nothing visible. The questions that Anne's discovery raises, about provenance, about transparency, about the ongoing relationship between Camilla's public role and her private history with this family, are questions that are now being asked in circles they weren't being asked in before. And William knows. That is perhaps the most significant thing of all. He knows. He is sitting with whatever he knows, in whatever form he received it, and he is doing what he has always done with the most difficult knowledge of his life, managing it, containing it, waiting. There is, in all of this, a particular cruelty to the timing. The royal family is in a period of significant transition. Charles is king in a way that is still settling, still finding its shape, still accommodating the reality that the Elizabethan era, so long, so stabilizing, so defining, is genuinely over, and something new is being established in its place. William and Catherine are building their version of what the monarchy will look like in the next generation. George is growing up, and into all of this, into the careful construction of this new chapter, comes a piece of old metal, sitting on a surface in a private room, connecting everything that happened 30 years ago to everything that is happening right now. You cannot separate this family from Diana. That is the thing that has always been true, and that each generation of observers has had to reckon with in a fresh way. She is not the past, she is the ground under the present. She is the thing that everything else is built on, or in reaction to, the event that reorganized the emotional architecture of this family so completely that no subsequent arrangement of its members has been able to fully resolve the reorganization. Her sons carry her. Her grandchildren inherit the carrying, and the objects, the rings, the photographs, the folded letters left at memorials, are the physical manifestation of something that refuses to become history. There will be those who say, it is just a ring. There will be those who argue for the most charitable interpretation, that there is a simple explanation, that the ring passed legitimately, that whatever Charles's silence meant in that moment, it did not mean what it appeared to mean. These interpretations are available. They may even be correct. But Anne's face, in the moment she saw it, George's note, written in a child's hand, folded and left at a memorial. The silence that fell in a room at Windsor, when one sibling looked at another and waited for an answer that did not come. These things happened. In whatever form they happened, in whatever register of certainty we choose to assign to what we know and what we infer, these things happened. And somewhere in the gap between the official silence and the private knowledge, the real story of this family continues to live. As it always has, as it probably always will. There is, I think, still something here we don't know. Something that hasn't surfaced yet. Something that is held within the private knowledge of the people who were in those rooms and had those conversations. The history of this family is full of things that took decades to come to light. Not through any dramatic unveiling, but through the slow accumulation of accounts, the gradual willingness of those involved to be slightly more candid than they were before, the way that time eventually loosens what protocol and self-protection held tight. Whether this is one of those things, whether we are watching the early moments of a story that will eventually be more fully told, is something none of us can know yet. But if you want to know how it develops, if you want to follow the thread when it moves again, when the next piece of this comes into view, then stay close. Because these stories don't end, they evolve, they circle back, they find new ways to break surface in a family that is always, simultaneously, managing its history and being defined by it. The ring was found, the note was written, the silence fell. What comes next is the question none of us can answer yet, but will be here when it does.